Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom, welcome back to today's Daf, which is YOMA Lamed Aleph. We begin on the bottom of Lamed Amud Beis. Says the Gemara 2 lines from the bottom of the Amud. Amalei Abaye l'Rabbi Yosef. We go back to our discussion regarding the Chiv Tvila prior to entering the Azara. Even if one knows with certainty that he's Tahir, we learn in the Mishnah that there's a Chiv Tvila before entering the Azara. How do we understand this halacha? We actually have three approaches. Shitas ben Zayma was, it's a din Torah, learned through a Kal V'chomer from the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, who is required to have many tefillas when switching from one location to the other, from outside to inside, from inside to outside. Certainly, when you're switching from a Makim Choil into the Makim Kodesh, a tefillah is in place. So according to Ben Zayma's approach, it's a Chiv min HaTorah. On the other hand, we have Rabbi Yehuda who disagrees. He says there's no Chiv min HaTorah. It's only a din d'Rabbanan, and this will be used as a means to awaken some old lost memory. Kedei lizkar tuma yishana, it will jog his memory and perhaps bring to the surface some old tuma that he still has on him, and as a result of that, he'll refrain from entering the Azara. So it's just a din d'Rabbanan. There's a third shita. This is the way Rashi learns. There's a third shita, Shitas Rabbanan, who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. A typical, ordinary person does not need a tefillah. The only time we require tefillah is by a mitzvah, who was heavily engaged in tumah for a long time. So even if he was tovel the previous night, we're concerned that perhaps in the interim he became tameh again. So he needs to be tovel today, again, prior to entering the Azara. Says the Gemara 2 lines from the bottom, Amalei Abaye l'Rabbi Yosef. Abaye asks Rabbi Yosef a question. If you suppose that this Tvila is only midrabbanan, let's adopt that approach. If that's the case, Tvila zu chaytzetz, oy einay chaytzetz. We know, generally speaking, if one has a chatzitza on his body as some sort of barrier, preventing the water from reaching him, that disrupts the Tvila. What about this Tvila d'Rabbanan? Does the chatzitza interfere or not? Chaytzetz or einay chaytzetz? Now, why would I think chatzitza wouldn't interfere? Asks Tosfos, why would this be different than any other tvila d'Rabbanan? For instance, those tfilas in the beginning of Masechah Shabbos, many tfilas d'Rabbanan, we don't find any such discussion, any shiloh of whether chatzitza would affect it or not. We assume that, it's just like any other tefillah. Why would I differentiate? Says Tosfos, because here it's different. In a case where Chachamim apply a tumah to a person, then that conforms to standard guidelines. You have to follow the regular procedure. You're tameh, do tefillah. Tefillah is tefillah. It doesn't make a difference. Why are you being tovel? Fact is, you are being considered tameh, whether it's midaraisa, midrabbanan. You have to do tefillah to address that tumah. And therefore, in that case, certainly chatzitza plays a role. But over here, says Tosfos, where really is no chashash tumah. In reality, he knows he's tahir. It's a ma'ala ba'alma. It's a chumri yasera. It's an added stringency that requires this type of procedure. So this tefillah is different. It's just to awaken some sort of memory that he might have embedded in his conscience. So perhaps just a ma'asa tefillah, even with a chatzitza, is sufficient to accomplish that goal. That's the Gemara Shaila. Now there's another explanation, because really, what good is tefillah with a chatzitza? Fine, so Tosfos differentiates. He says, this is only a ma'asa tefillah, and it's not really coming to address tumah. But a tefillah with a chatzitza, we suppose, is really worthless, because there's no contact between water and body. So what's the point of being tefillah with a chatzitza? There's so wonderful pshat in the name of Reb Chaim Brisker. He says like this: a tefillah, even with a chatzitza, is a ma'asa tefillah. We learn, the Gemara teaches us that tefillah is poisel. A chatzitza is poisel the tefillah. So of course he's in the water. There was a ma'asa, he calls it a ma'asa bi asmaim. The person has entered water. He's underwater. So as far as the gavra, in verse terms, the gavra, the person is immersed. He has been toivel. Problem is there was some sort of barrier. The water didn't entirely come into contact with his entire guf. That's called a chatzitza. That's a poisel. It invalidates the tefillah. It acts against the tefillah. It contradicts the tefillah. It's poisel, the tefillah. But there was a tefillah there. Therefore, when you have to really do a tefillah minat Torah, or even, as Tosfos points out, when a tefillah is required in the Rabbanah to remove tumah, then you have to follow the standard procedure. You can't have chatzitza, but the chatzitza will come along and invalidate the ma'aseh tefillah. Although you did a tefillah, but the chatzitza comes and negates the tefillah. But perhaps, in this case where it's just a resemblance of tefillah, perhaps even a ma'aseh tefillah is sufficient, despite the fact that there's a chatzitza there. Chacham didn't go to that extent and say it has to follow the standard procedure where even a chatzitza would invalidate, would negate the tefillah. No, a ma'aseh tefillah, where he's going through the procedure, that'll be enough. That'll be enough to evoke some sort of forgotten memory. That'll be enough. So that's the Gemara Shiloh. Is a tefillah even with a chatzitza enough? Well, no. Perhaps we follow standard procedure, and once we require tefillah, it needs to fit the bill. It needs to follow proper procedure. Chaytzeit or any chaytzeit. Amalei, Rabbi Yosef responded, certainly, yeah. You have to follow standard procedure called the Tikkun Rabbanon. Ke'ein D'oraisa Tikkun. Whenever the Chachamim established a takana, it generally mirrors, it emulates, it follows, it's modeled after the takana D'oraisa. Meaning, the Chachamim said b'tovel, they meant just do a tefillah the way you're supposed to. Just as you would do it in Minat Torah, you do the same in the Rabbanon. We don't differentiate. I have another shaila. So we say, before entering the Azorah, you need to be toivel. What if only a part of him enters the Azorah? A partial kenisa, his hand, his foot. Bia b'miktzas, a partial entry. Shema bia, is it considered like an entry and requires tefillah? Or perhaps not. How far did the Chachamim go? Do you actually have to enter into that? So even a partial entry is enough. Amalei, so he responded, I'll bring a raya. I'll bring a raya from the Bahoinos, the thumbs. We had a brisa yesterday that a mitzvah has to be toivel before doing what? He's not going to enter the Azorah in the state of Mechutz Kippurim. All he's doing is extending his thumb into the Azorah. What do we see from there? Despite the fact that it's only a partial entry, a tefillah is required. V'tanya, we learned in the brisa, mitzvah toivel v'oimed b'shar niknar. He has to be toivel and then positions himself as shar niknar and puts his thumbs into the Azorah. So again, the answer is yes. B'yeh b'miktzah is considered. Ivoilu, the Bnei Yeshiva asked the following shayla. What about in the following case? Ma'u sheyasa sakin aruk. What if this fellow brought along a long knife? V'yishchot. Decided to do shchita from outside the Azorah. Is that okay without tefillah? He's not entering the Azorah, but he is engaged in avodah. And the question applies twofold. Because remember, we have Ben Zoyma on the one hand, who says, this chiyuv, tefillah is minat Torah. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the Rabbanah who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. They don't even apply a tefillah to a midrabbanah, to an ordinary person, except in certain situations like a mitzvah, because he was dayish betumah, he was heavily involved in tumah. So that's the other side of the spectrum. They never require tefillah, except by mitzvah. So this question of ma'o sheyasa sakin aruka v'yishchot, can a person bring along a long knife and do shchita from outside the Azorah and be exempt from tefillah, applies to Ben Zoyma and to the Rabban. What do we mean? Tiboilu Ben Zoyma, the question could be asked according to Ben Zoyma, who says that this chiyuv tefillah is minat Torah. Tiboilu Rabban, likewise, it could be asked according to the Rabban, who say there is no chiyuv tefillah for your typical person. Perhaps this will be different. Let's see. Tiboilu Rabban, the pligi aled Rabbi Yehuda. The question will apply to the Rabbanah Shita, who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, and they hold there's no chiyuv tefillah. Explains the Gemara Tiboilu Ben Zoyma. This question could be posed in accordance with Shita's Ben Zoyma, who is mechayev tefillah upon entry, and is chayevet minat Torah. Perhaps ben zoyma only obligates tefillah elo legavoy. When one actually enters. So the fact he's actually being nichnas la'azorah, that requires tefillah. But if he's still outside, there's no need for tefillah here. Despite the fact that he's involved in avodah. He's not in the Mokum Kodesh. The Mokum Kodesh is what triggers the Chiv Tefillah. Oidilmo, perhaps you can say, Asilim Shuchet. Although he's actually outside, but he might be drawn. He might get pulled after his carbon. Well, once he's doing Shechita, the carbon might move. He might have to follow the carbon, or for whatever other reason he might decide to get drawn to his carbon and into the Beis HaMikdash. So there is that concern present. And therefore, perhaps a tefillah is in place, despite the fact that he claims to be standing outside, but he might get drawn in. And therefore, chiv tefillah would apply. Tosfos asks, well, we have a Gemara in Zvachim, which tells us that a person who's tummy should not do shechita l'chatchila. Why? Because he might actually touch the behemah. Asks Tosfos, it seems from the Gemara that we're not choshesh that osilim shuche, that he might get drawn after his behemah. He might touch it somehow, but we're not choshesh that he'll actually follow the behemah to the azor. And here we see that we are choshesh. The Gemara poses this as a concern. Why that discrepancy between two Gemaras? Yesh Lemer says Tosfos, there's a big difference. When we're speaking about a tummy, there's less chance that he'll get drawn into the azor. He knows he's meant to stay out. He knows that he's in a state of tummy, he doesn't belong in the azor. So over there, the chashash is not that he'll get drawn into the azora. The chashash is only that he might actually come into contact with his carbon somehow. But in our case, where we're speaking about a person who considers himself completely tar, here there's a greater chashash that it might inadvertently get pulled into the azara asilim shuche, and therefore perhaps he should do tefillah prior to getting involved with his masa shchita. So that's one shayla in the Gemara. According to Shitas ben Zoma, chiv tefillah is min Torah. What about if he's not entering the azara? He's just doing shchita from outside. Is he potter from tefillah? Or perhaps he should be tevel because he might actually end up in the azara. Continues the Gemara. Same question could be applied according to Shitas Rabbanan. The pligya lei Rabbi Yehuda, who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, they hold that there's no chiv tefillah ever. Ad kan like Amir Rabban Hasam. Perhaps this sheet of the Rabban is only over there. The loika avodah avodah. The fellow's entering the azara but not doing avodah. Fine. We don't find a chiv tefillah. Aval hacha. The avodah avodah. As opposed to this case where he's actually engaged in avodah loy. This is different. Perhaps tefillah is required. Maybe somehow we'll learn it through Kavachomer from the Kohen Gadol. We see tefillah is required when he switches from one avodah to the other. Certainly when he's coming from nothing to something, from non-avodah to ya-avodah, a tefillah is required. So maybe this carries more weight. It's different than just entering the azara. Oidilma, or perhaps Leishna, there's no difference. According to the Shita, there's never chiv tefillah, whether he enters the azara or even if he's engaged in avodah. Take it, we leave it unresolved. So we have three shaylas regarding this tefillah prior to entering the azara. Does the chatzitza apply? Yes. Hilchas chatzitza applied here as well. Is a partial entry considered? Yes, it is. What if he's engaged in avodah from outside the azara? There was no knisa, but there was avodah. Question was, according to Ben Zayim, who's very machmer? But perhaps this is different because he's outside. Or they'll get drawn in to the azar. That's one shayla. The shayla applies to the Rabban, who is very mekel. Generally, don't require a tefillah. Well, perhaps this is different. He's not only entering; he's actually involved in avodah. So, although it's from the outside, he's involved in avodah. Maybe tefillah is in place, and we leave it. Take. Continues the Gemara. Chamish tefillah v'asara kedushin tevel. Can God on Yom Kippur? We'll do 5 tefillahs and 10 times kiddush yodayim v'raglayim from the kiyur. Toner Rabbanan. Chamish tefillos, vasar kiddushin, toivel kohen gadol, ume kaddish, boy boy. Throughout Yom Kippur does 5 tefillos and 10 kiddush. V'chulon ba'kodesh. All of these are meant to take place in the Mokum Kodesh. We'll learn it from our pasuk. V'rochetz Mokum Kodesh. So all the kiddushin, all the tefillos, v'chulon ba'kodesh, b'beis ha'parva. All the tefillos took place on the rooftop of the Beis HaParva that had a mikveh there for him. And it was considered a Mokum Kodesh. Asks Tosfos, we know that Gagin of Aliyah Loinis Gach, rooftops, upper floors, even in the Azara, don't have Kedushas Hazara. Why do we consider the mikveh, which was situated on the rooftop of Beis HaParva, to be a Makam Kodesh? Answers Tosfos. Veishleimar Gag Beis HaParva Hoyeshave L'Karka Azara. Actually, the Beis HaParva was a below level structure, and the rooftop was the same level as the Karka Azara, in which case is considered part of the Azara area and has Kedusha. Continues the Gemara, so all the tefillas took place in this location, which was in the Azara. Chutz Merishon, except for the first tefillah, which was conducted prior to entering the Azara, which of course had to take place outside the Azara. It was outside the Azara, Al Gabi Sharamayim, on top of the Sharamayim. Ubetzad Dishkasa Haisa was next to his room, Kohen Gadol's room. Amrabai, Shmamina, we can conclude from this. Ein Itam, the source of the mikveh, the water flowed from a spring called Ein Itam, which was the next mountain over. That source, that spring, supplied the water for this mikveh, which was situated where? On top of the Shar Hamayim. Says Abaya, we can conclude from this how tall, how high Ein Itam was. Ein Itam Gavoya Makaka Azara was actually elevated from the Azara level, Esrim V'Sholish Amas. It was 23 Amas higher in elevation from the Karka Azara. Why is that? And what's it negate to us? So Rashi says here, right in the middle of the Amid, Ein Itam Mimenu Bo Amas Hamayim Leveis Tvilas Shar Hamayim. Ein Itam supplied water for this mikveh, which was situated above the Shar Hamayim. Sha'alachim. Ulefi Inin HaMakrois, looking through the Psukim, says Rashi, nearly it appears to me, this Ein Itam is actually Shumayan Mein Avtoyach Ha'amar B'Sevi Yeshua. This is the main Avtoyach described over there. Shemesham Hagvul Meshapeh V'Yerid L'Mizrach L'Marav. This was the high point in Eretz Yisrael, the highermost point in Eretz Yisrael, and from there the Gvul, the boundary, would slope downward to Mizrach and to Marav. V'hu Hagavoya B'Chol Eretz Yisrael. This was the highest point in Eretz Yisrael, and it seems like it was the Gvul of Yehuda that we're discussing, and being that this was the highest point, so going east it would go downward, and likewise going west. What's the point of Abaye speaking about the elevation, 23 Amos? What's the point? They figured, let's build a Beis HaMikdash on the highest point in Eretz Yisrael, Ein Itam. Then they decided, no, Amri Nichsive Purta, let's lower it a bit. Of being safe of Shachin. The pasuk describes the Beis HaMikdash, the Makam Shechina, as being safe between the shoulders, a lower point, not on top of the head, but the shoulder area. Which means it's not meant to be at the highest point in Eretz Yisrael. The next mountain over, a bit lower than Ein Itam. The Shamina Minei. Shugavay Menakot. We learn from this that Ein Itam was higher than the Beis HaMikdash. V'lei Parish Menoli. And the Gemara doesn't explain where we got this from. How do we know that it was the highest point? The Parish L'Abayach, and Abayah proves it over here. Continues Rashi. Gavoya Mekaka Azara Esrim V'Shalosh Amas. We're going to prove that Ein Itam evidently was 23 Amas higher than the Azara. Why? Kimidas Goyva Sharamayim. It needed to be higher than the Azara, the same height as the Sharamayim. Ubinyan Klishal Shalish Amas Milamala. Lahachzik Arboimsa. It had to be 23 Amas higher than the Azara. Why? Because the Sharamayim, on which the mikveh was situated, was 20 Amas high. Plus you have the actual mikveh itself, which is 3 Amas high. And that proves that the water source was also 23 Amas higher than the Azara. She'i efsha l'mayim lalis lahar shugavoya mimakim shenoivim sham. We know scientifically water will only rise back to the original level. Suppose you have a straw and you pour water in, you bend the straw in half, the water on the other side will rise, the end point of the water will equal and level the level of the starting point. Same thing here. Apparently with underground water works the same way. Somehow there's the vacuum effect, that if we have an in-ground source of water, a spring coming down from Ein Itam, which is high up, it will eventually make its way back up through the underground stream, all the way to the same level. The final destination will be equal in level to its original point of departure. So how do we get water up to the top of the Shara Mayim? It wouldn't rise higher than its source. Apparently, says Abaye, the source of this spring, the Ein Itam, was Oshli, also 23 amas higher than the Azar. So it began 23 amas high, came all the way down to the Beis HaMikdash, and then would rise, I suppose in ground, all the way up to the top of the Shara Mayim, up to the mikveh, which was exactly 23 amas higher than the Karka Azara. So the level of the mikveh would equal the level of its starting point. Let's go back to the Gemara. 8 lines from the bottom. Amar Abaye, once again, Shema Mino, we can conclude from this. Being that the mikveh was situated on top of Shara Mayim, now we can figure out how high Shara Ein Itam was, the source of the spring. Ein Itam Gavoya Mekarka Azara Es Mishalish Amis. Apparently the source of the spring was also 23 amas higher than the Karka Azara. That's not. All the entranceways in the Beis HaMikdash were Goivan Esrim Amma, V'Rachvan Esrim Amas, or 20 amas high and 10 amas wide. Chutz Mishal Ulam, except the one by the Ulam, which was 20 by 40 by 20. So we know that you have to account for 20 amas higher than the Karka Azara, just to get to the top of Shara Mayim. How tall was the actual mikveh itself? At least 3 amas. V'Tanya. V'Rachatz, the pasuk says, V'Rachatz, B'Mayim, Eskol B'Soroi. We learn from here as follows. You meant to go into the mikveh, B'Mayim. V'Rachatz B'Mayim. The water. The known water. What does that mean? V'Rachatz B'Soroi, B'Mayim, B'Mei mikveh. It has to be unique waters. It can't be drawn with a kli ma'im shuvin. Also, it has to be stationary water. It has to be a makam of ma'im. That's number one. From the words kol b'sari, we learn that the water of the mikveh has to have the capacity, has to accommodate a person all at once. It has to be large enough so a person can enter all at once. Ma'im shekol gufay oil ben. How much is that? How large an area? V'kamahin amma al amma, an amma by an amma, b'rum gimel amois, with 3 amois height. So it needs to be at a minimum of 1 by 1 by 3. We know from here that the mikveh was 3 amas higher than the Shara Mayim. Evidently, Ein Itam, which was the source of the spring, needed to be 23 amas higher, had to be elevated 23 amas beyond the Karka Azar, which would allow and enable this water to rise to the same height. This is Esakashi. He says, how do you know that the mikveh was 3 amas tall? Maybe at a flat mikveh. So it was 3 by 1 by 1. So he says, Mastama did it in a way which was convenient for the Kohen Gadol. He was weakened on that day. He was fasting. He was chulsha the Kohen Gadol. And we assume they fashioned the mikveh to his convenience. And it's much easier to be toivel standing up. So we assume the mikveh was 1 by 1 by 3 in height, which required the water to rise to the level of 23 amos higher than the Karka. The Shir Chachamim estimated Mei Mikveh Arba'im Sa. How much water is required to fill up this water hole? 1 by 1 by 3, 40 Sa. Okay. Says the Gemara, Va'ikra Amma Tikra Va'amma Maziva. 23 amos isn't enough. Because remember, we had a Shara Mayim, which has somewhat of a roof on which they put the mikveh. So we need an amma for the tikra, for the actual ceiling. Another amma for some sort of cement insulation for keeping the water in place. So it gives you another 2 ammas. So you need 25. Sha'arim the Beis HaMikdash, given the shishaninu. The sha'arim the Beis HaMikdash, since they were made of shisha, of marble, and they were strong and self-sufficient. B'mashu avdilu. The tikra, the ceiling, needed to be very thin, didn't have to be an amma, because it was made of strong material. So the tikra was very thin, and the maziva was very, very thin. You don't need to have another 2 amas. It says we still have something there. But you had that little bit to add to the 23, over which the water had to rise. Since this extra little bit doesn't add up to an amma, Abaye didn't add it to the calculation. But you're right. Technically, you need a bit more than 23. You need 23 aside from the tikra and the maziva, so it's 23 and a bit. Continues the Gemara, Pirsu Sudden Shabbatz. Mishnah tells us in preparation for Tefillah, they would spread a linen sheet to protect the Kohen Gadol, protect his dignity. They bring the Rambam. The Rambam says that a Kohen Gadol required a special measure of honor and respect. We have to be mechaber him. Therefore, they would cover up the area in preparation for the Tefillah. Ma'isha Shabbatz, fine, they needed a sheet, but why made of linen? Rav Kahana, just as Rav Kahana said later in the second tefillah, the reason why they used sudden shalbutz was kadei sheyakir, shavoides hayoyim bebigdei putz, so that the Kohen Gadol becomes mindful, he pays attention to the fact that some of the avodas today will be conducted differently than throughout the year. Today's avodas, at least some of them, are done with white begadim, linen begadim. That's why we spread the sheet to get them focused. Hachanam here as well, regarding the first tefillah, the same teretz can be applied. We spread a linen sheet, sheyakir, shabaydas hayay, b'vigdei putz, so he does pay attention to that fact as well. Continues the Gemara, Pashat, so he removed his bigdei chol, yorad, he went down, v'tavel, and was tavel. Allah, he came back up in his tapak, and he wiped himself dry. Now why does the Mishnah have to speak about wiping dry? There are several pshatim. Some explain to avoid chatzitza, because the wetness will create a barrier between the begadim and the kohen, and the begadim are meant to be flush on the flesh of the kohen. That's one pshat. Another pshat is practically the moisture might ruin the begadim. And a third pshat, interesting pshat, Yom Kippur today. He's meant to engage in inui, not meant to wash yourself. So he's meant to minimize the pleasure effect, and therefore dry yourself immediately after coming up from the mikveh. In either case, he came up in his topic, he dried up. They presented him with his 8 begadim. Some of them were zav. Velavash, he donned the new set of begadim. V'kidish yadav v'raglav, and he washed his hands and feet from the kir, which was a requirement upon every switch of clothing. They presented him with his carbon tamid kratzai. Kratzai is a very unique term. It's referring to a shchita, but he couldn't complete the entire shchita. We'll see in a second why. So he did most of the shchita, until the point where it was halachically accepted as a shchita, most of the simanim, and then he let go. Umirek, and somebody else completed, Mirek is lashon completed, Umirek acher, another Kohen came along and completed the shchita al yadai, on his behalf. Kibbalas hadam, then the Kohen Gadol immediately proceeded to the next stage, Kabbalas hadam. And that explains why he couldn't complete the entire shchita process, because he himself had to do the Kabbalah as well. It's something which was unique to Yom Kippur. Kohen Gadol had to do all the avodas, shchita and Kabbalah, which was somewhat impractical, because as soon as he begins the shchita, the dam begins flowing. So you have to hurry up, do part of the shchita until the point where it's acceptable as a shchita, let go, have somebody else take over, and then run right over with the kli to be makabel the dam. So he was makabel the dam, uz raka, he did zrikas hadam, and then proceeded to the other avodas. Nichnas lachtik teres shachar. He went into the Heichal to be makted the first dose of teres, the morning teres. Ula teres haneres, to clean out the neres of the menorah. Ula hakr v'saroish v'saivorim, to be makriv all the chalokim, the ivorim of the tamid, v'sachavitin, his carbon chavitin, v'sayayin, wine, which was part of the minchas and sachem of the carbon tamid. So the teres was between zrika of dam tamid and the akravis ivar. Continues the Mishnah. Teres shel shachar. In fact, the morning teres was ha'isa kreva bein dam levar, came between the dam and the ivarim of the tamid, as we just explained. This was different than the teres shel bein arbaim. Shel bein arbaim, over there, it was set up differently. The teres was between bein ivarim, between the ivarim of the carbon tamid, and the nusachim of the carbon tamid, as the Gemara will elaborate on further. So we had the seder of the Avos HaTamid, the teres, etc. Concludes the Mishnah. We spoke about the Kohen Gadol being Tegel Yom Kippur. If the Kohen Gadol happened to be an elderly fellow, or one who was sensitive to cold, So what would they do to make for a convenient tefillah in this freezing cold mikveh coming from Ayin Itam, this fresh spring water? They would actually preheat some water before Yom Kippur. Umatilin, the sechatzoinin, come Yom Kippur, they would pour it into the cold water of the mikveh. Kedei shetafig sinasim, so that it would remove the bite, the chill of the mikveh, and would allow it to be toivel. Let's take a look at Rashi. 7 lines from the top of the Amid. Masnisin, he would be toivel, and afterwards it says v'nistapik, he would wipe himself dry. Mes'atev ba'alunta shal beged, he would wrap himself with a some sort of material. Lisfag mayim shal b'sorah, he would use his towel to absorb the mayim which was on him. V'nistapik means v'niskaneach, he would wipe himself dry. Interesting, the halacha that one is not allowed to be seichet sa'aris on Shabbos. One may not wring water, liquid out of hair on Shabbos. There's a big shayla what to do on Shabbos. If one is toivel on Shabbos, how do you go about drying oneself? So it's interesting that in the Sefer Shmir Shabbos Kilchase brings from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says if he's drying himself into a towel, in which case the water is going to le'ibud, it's going to waste, and it's not really visible, it's going straight into the towel. The intent here is not to create water, just to dry oneself, and he says it's mutter. I heard from Shlomo Miller Shlita, he says that the best way would be to follow the Ben Ish Chai's approach. Ben Ish Chai says one should just surface dry himself, tap dry. Take the towel and just gently tap on one's hair to absorb the surface liquid, but not to go deeper than that to actually wring out the hair. It's interesting to note that Rashi takes great pains to go into the arichas here. Nistapik, misatev, baluntis. You just say dries himself. He describes in great detail that he would wrap himself with a beged. Perhaps trying to circumvent this discussion, this shaila of schita on his hair. That's why he do it in an indirect way. Just wrap himself. And the water would just get absorbed into the beged by itself. Perhaps that would be pshat in Rashi. I actually saw from the Be'er Moshe, the Betzina Rav. He says the answer is poshet. The Kohen Gadol, the Gemara Sanhedrin says the Kohen Gadol would take a haircut once a week. So he didn't have much hair to worry about, and there was no concern about schita on his hair. In any case, continues Rashi. The kiddush yadav raglav. So after the tefillah, he would do kiddush yadayim raglaim, rinse his hands and feet from the kir, minakir. And that was required for every switch of clothing. Every time he switched out of begadim and switched into new begadim, he would have to go through this process, be mekadesh, yadayim raglaim from the kir. Kedil of Kamon, it's more learns from a pasuk. Shetzarach l'chol chalifa. Speak the ayoyim. Kiddush lefshita, the kiddush levisha. Every time he would switch, he would have to have a double kiddush yadayim raglaim. One in honor of the switching out process, the pshita, and one in honor of the new begadim, the new set of clothing. If that's the case, so why over here in the Mishnah we only discuss one kiddush? Answers Rashi, very pashut. Utvila rishayna zu shehafshita shabigdei chayli. In this case, he's switching out of ordinary begadim. Therefore, there's no need to make kiddush on account of that switching out. The undressing doesn't need a kiddush. A kiddush is only required if it involves bigdei kodesh. That explains why in our Mishnah he undresses without a kiddush, but then when he puts on the new begadim, which are bigdei kodesh, a kiddush yadayim v'raglayim is required. Kagada proceeds to the korban tamid kratzai. Farsh v'gemara exactly what that means. Umirik acher v'gomar kohen acher shchita. A kohen comes along and fills in, completes the shchita. Why? Why couldn't the kohen gadol complete the entire shchita? Lafi she'ein kabbalas adam ksheira el b'kohen gadol. Because not only does the kohen gadol have to do the shchita, he also has to do the kabbalas adam. V'tzorch lemar lekabel. He has to hurry up to get to the dam before it spills onto the floor. So he can't allow himself the liberty, the luxury of completing the entire shechita. He has to stop midway as soon as it's halachically acceptable, and have another kohen take over, and then the kohen gadol hurries over to do the kabbalah. It's interesting to note that there's actually a machlekes rishonim. The Baal Amor maintains, indeed, that everything on Yom Kippur had to be done through the kohen gadol, even the korban tavod, which is not really uniquely a Yom Kippur korban. It's a korban that he brought every day. Still, you have to do everything through the kohen gadol. And it seems that Rashi follows that shita. The Mechamas Hashem, on the other hand, the Ramban, he disagrees. He says the Kohen Gadol is only needed for karbanos which are Yom Kippur specific, as opposed to Karban Tamid, which although was done through a Kohen Gadol, but didn't need a Kohen Gadol. Rashi is mashma that it had to be done through a Kohen Gadol. He says she'ein kabbalas hadam ksher elo Kohen Gadol. He seems to be following the shita of Baal Ma'or that all karbanos on Yom Kippur needed to be done strictly through the Kohen Gadol. So he begins the shchita process, and the next Kohen comes along and completes the shchita al yodeh. What does al yodeh mean? B'shviloi, on account of him, on his behalf. K'may koitzitz adamai de'atzma, it's mishba metzia. Al yodeh means on behalf of oneself. Inami, another pshat al yodeh is al yodeh loshan achrav. It means close by, following. V'samachlei. Aharbi yesh b'sefer Ezra al yodeh hechzek pleinis hachim. Continues Rashi. K'terish hashachar. Here is a kreva, more farish. Why did they follow this order? And the Mishnah concludes, how did they somewhat warm up the mikvah? Machaman lechaman, be'erev Yom Kippurim. They would do so from erev Yom Kippur. Matil Yom Kippurim l'soich chakak binyan beis tfilasai. And then on Yom Kippur they would place it in some sort of crevice in the mikvah, and then mix it in. Shetafig lahamer miyatzinasai, to alleviate the chill. B'miktzas k'may vayafak liboy. This is in Parshas Vayigash. When Yaakov heard the good news that Yosef is alive, Pasuk says Vayafak liboy. The Ramban describes it somewhat as a heart attack. So Vayafak means that it stopped functioning. It lost its power. Mefigin Taman is another similar example. It lost its potency, its flavor. V'reichel nomer, it didn't lose its reach. M'targeminan v'reichel pug, it didn't lose its reach. So pug we see means losing its power, and here it means to remove some of the power, the chill of that spring water in his mikvah. Back to the Gemara. Amru Rabbanon Kamei Rav Papa. Rav Papa's Talmidim asked him like this: Hadlik Rav Meir. Our Mishnah doesn't seem to be in line with L'shitas Rabbi Meir. Let's stop for a moment. We have machlokes, which is going to be discussed later in the Gemara, between Rav Meir and Rabban. We're going to learn from a pasuk that whenever the Kohen Gadol would switch from one set of begadim to the other, he would have to be tovel and also conduct a double kiddush yudayim reglaim. He had to rinse his hands and feet twice from the kir on account of that switching ceremony. The question was, how do we go about it? How do we establish the sequence of events? Rabbi holds it was like this: on account of switching out, no kiddush is required. He'll be paishet his old begadim and then proceed to the new begadim as follows: kiddush yadayim reglaim, in anticipation of the new begadim, to sort of prepare him for the new begadim. Then he would be loivish the new set of begadim, and then complete that process with another kiddush yadayim reglaim while he's already wearing those begadim. That confirms the levisha, that helps him relate, so to speak, to the new begadim. So according to Meir, it would seem both Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim were directed at the new set of begadim, one prior and one after. According to Rabbanon, it was different. First you do Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, and then be Paisha the old begadim, then be Leivish the new begadim, then be Kaddish again, which would seem to indicate the point and purpose of the first Kiddush was in honor of the Pshita. It was kind of bidding farewell to the old begadim. The next Kiddush was in honor of the Levisha. So according to Meir, it would seem both Kiddush were directed at the Levisha and unrelated to the Pshita. So switching out from the old begadim. According to Rabbanon, the first Kiddush was directed at the Pshita, the switching out process, whereas the second Kiddush was directed at the Levisha process. Now, in our Mishnah, we learn that the Kohen Gadol would switch out of what? Of Bigdei Chayil, put on the Bigdei Kodesh, which were presented to him, the Bigdei Zav, and then do Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. What happened to the two Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim? There was only one Kiddush in our Mishnah. Why? So according to Rabban, we understand perfectly well why the first Kiddush was missing. You know why? Because he never switched out of Bigdei Kodesh. Kiddush is only required when he's switching out of Bigdei Kodesh. Now Mishnah switched out of Bigdei Chayil into Bigdei Kodesh. So the second Kiddush, on account of the Bigdei Kodesh, is required. But only one Kiddush. You don't need another one on account of switching out of Bigdei Chayil. So our Mishnah is fully in line with the Rabbanan, but not in line with Rab Meir, who seems to hold that both Kiddushes are applied to the Levisha. In which case, even when he's switching out of Chol into Kodesh, he would need a double Kiddush Yodayim Raglayim. One before wearing the new begadim, one after he put them on. How do like Rab Meir? Our Mishnah is not following Rab Meir. Rab Meir, because according to him, Kivan the Amar Trei Kiddushei, Levisha Avelu, because according to Rab Meir, was that both Kiddush were applied to the Levisha of the new begadim, Hachanami. In our case as well, he should need two Kiddushim for the Levisha, because he's putting on Big Day Kodesh. He needs one Kiddush prior to the Ma'aser Levisha and one following. Apparently, our Mishnah is not in line with Rab Meir, rather following the Rabbanan Shita. The first Kiddush was directed at the Pshita, at the switching out, at the removal of the old begadim. And in this case, where he's removing Big Day Chol, we don't need that Kiddush. Therefore, we only need one Kiddush on account of the new begadim Big Day Kodesh on the Levisha. No, I disagree. Bein Rabbanan, Bein Rab Meir. According to all Shitas, Chad Ab Shita, the Big Day Kodesh. The first Kiddush comes on account of removing the Big Day Kodesh. V'chad Al Levisha. And the second Kiddush comes on account of donning the new begadim. There's no disagreement as far as perspective, as far as designation. All Shitas agree that the first Kiddush is coming in honor of the Pshita, to enhance, facilitate the removal of the Big Day Kodesh. And the second Kiddush is coming on account of the Levisha, the new set of begadim that he's putting on now. And therefore, the first Kiddush only applies when he's removing Big Day Kodesh, as opposed to our Mishnah, where what is he removing? Big Day Chol. And therefore, that first Kiddush is not required. Now, Mishnah could be following both Shittas. Oh, if that's the case, so what's the disagreement between Rab Meir and Rabbanan? It's not a question of designation or perspective. Both Shittas agree. The reason why there are two Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, one is on account of switching out, in honor of the old begadim, which is removing, and one on account of the new begadim, which are arriving now. So why is there a difference in the sequence, in the Seder? Says Rav Papa, I'll tell you, very posh, it's based on a pasuk. The Seder is derived from a pasuk. V'achabaka miflagi, Machlek is based on the pasuk. Upashat v'rachatz v'lavash, and we learn from this pasuk that the rechitza, you notice the word rechitza is situated between a pashat, removing of the old begadim, and v'lavash, putting on the new begadim. We learn a drasha that both need a kiddush. Removal requires a kiddush, and dressing the new begadim requires a kiddush. So it's a question of sequence. Rab Meir Savar, Makish Pshita Levisha. Let's make a hekesh between switching out and switching in. Ma Levisha, just as the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim associated with the new begadim takes place when, all agree, it takes place after he put on the new begadim. We're going to see later in the Sugi why. So Ma Levisha, just as when it comes to the Levisha, when does that Kiddush take place? Loivesh, first he switches into the new begadim, V'achach Mekadosh, and then follows with the Kiddush. So he does the Maisa and then the Kiddush. Af Pshita, likewise when it comes to the Kiddush associated with the removal, Poishet, first he removes, V'achach Mekadosh, and then does Kiddush. They're trying to explain. First comes the Ikar and then the Tafel. First the Maisa Kiddush. The Maisa Pshita. And then comes the Kiddush. The Maisa Levish, then comes the Kiddush. That's what according to Rab Meir. You do it in that order. You push it, then you Mekadosh on account of the Pshita. You Levish, and you Mekadosh on account of the Levish. But Rabbanan Sabri, they put it differently. They say Makish Pshita Levish. Once again, we connect the two things. Removal, switching out to switching in. But we do it a bit differently. Ma Levisha, Kshu Lavish Mekadosh. Just as the Kiddush associated with wearing the new begadim takes place when? Once he's already wearing the begadim. It's not Mistaver says Yishan that he's going to do Kiddush when he's undressed. So in any case, it's coming to honor the new begadim while the begadim are already being worn. Af Pshita, likewise, when it comes to the Kiddush associated with undressing, Kshu Lavish Mekadosh. When does the Kiddush take place? When he's still wearing them. Therefore, according to Rabbanan, we switch things around a bit. We do Kiddush while he's wearing, then he's Paishit, and then he's Loivish, and then he's Mekadosh again. So according to this approach of Rav Papa, our Mishnah could work according to all shittas. Why? Because both Rameir and Rabbanan both agree that the first Kiddush is directed at the old set of Begadim. The second Kiddush directed at the new set of Begadim. In our Mishnah, where the old set of Begadim is Big Day Chayil, no Kiddush is required for that. And therefore only one Kiddush is needed in our Mishnah. Hamali Rabban Rav Papa. The Rabbanan responded to him, you can't say that. How can you say that? How can you propose that both Rameir and Rabbanan agree on perspective? It's just a question of sequence. In which case, even according to Rameir, in a case where he's switching out of Chayil to Kiddush, such as in our Mishnah, only one Kiddush is required. But it's not so. We have a clear brisa which indicates otherwise. That according to Rameir, when he's switching from Chayil to Kiddush, you need twice Kiddush. Vatanya, pairs who sudden shabutz, beinoil binam. He spread this linen sheet, pashat. He removed his big dechol, v'yarad, v'taval, Allah, in his tapok. He wiped himself dry. Heavy lo big zav. They presented him with the big zav. V'lavash. He got dressed. V'kiddush ad v'raglav. And he did kiddush. Only one kiddush. Why? Because the removal of the old begadim doesn't require kiddush. It will be dechol. He only needs one kiddush on account of the levisha of big kiddush. That's Rabbanan shit. Rameir, you need two kiddush. Pashat. He removed the big dechol. V'kiddush ad v'raglav. And then v'yarad, v'taval, ola, v'nistapok. And then he got the new begadim. Hevi lo big zav, v'lavash, v'kiddush ad v'raglav. It's clear that according to Rameir, even when he's switching out of chayil to kiddush, twice kiddush is required. Why? Apparently there's a difference of perspective between Rameir and the Rabbanan. Whereas Rabbanan hold that we split the kiddush as follows. The first kiddush is on account of undressing, which doesn't apply to b'dei chayil. The second one is on account of the new begadim. And therefore now Mishnah, only one kiddush is required because he's switching out of chayil to kiddush. Only the second kiddush on account of the levisha. According to Rameir, it's different, very different. Brisa tells us, according to Rameir, twice kiddush is required, even in this case when he's going from chayil to kiddush. Apparently, it's pretty clear that according to Rameir, he looks at it different. The twice kiddush were on account of the new set of begadim, unrelated to the undressing process, to the switching out process. It was related to switching into the new set of begadim. As follows: one kiddush prior to the ma'aseh levisha, to prepare him, to enable him to be lavish, and one once he's wearing it already, on account of the covet of the begadim, to have him absorb the begadim, so to speak. But they both relate to the new set of begadim. So our Mishnah, which only requires one kiddush, is apparently not following Rabbe's shita. He would hold that even in our Mishnah, we're switching from chayil to kiddush, you need twice kiddush, in honor of the new big day kiddush. So this was the Rabbanan responding to Rav Papa. Amarlu, so he responded, he conceded. Tanya, if it says so in a brisa, Tanya, okay, I concede. It was just a suggestion, but if it's clear, if it's clearly stated otherwise, then fine. Says the Gemara, Bishlam the Rameir. We learned in the Mishnah that Kohen Gadol will have 5 tefillahs and 10 times Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So whenever there was a switch over, one set of gun to the other, he would do tefillah and Kiddush twice. Bishlam the Rameir, according to Rameir, we understand how he got to number 10. Hainu the Meshkachas Lasor. We understand how he gets to number 10. Why? Let's think of it like this. He went 5 times into Big Day Kodesh. He started with Big Day Chayil, switched into the Big Day Zav, which according to Rameir requires double Kiddush. Right? According to Rameir, we just concluded the double Kiddush is on account of the new Begadim. One prior to the Levisha, one after the Levisha. So when he switches to Big Day Zav, it's 2. It's Big Day Lavan, it's 2. To the next Big Day Zav, it's 2. Big Day Lavan is 2. And the final Big Day Zav will have 2 Kiddush. That's how it gets to number 10. El Rabbanan Tishav. But according to Rabbanan, we only come up with 9 opportunities for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. Why? Because according to Rabbanan, the Kiddush is distributed as follows. 1 on account of removal, switching out, and 1 on account of switching in. So the first time, the one described in our Mishnah, only required 1 Kiddush. There was no Kiddush on account of switching out, because it was a big Chayil. So switching into Big Day Zav the first time required 1 Kiddush. The next switch into Big Day Lavan required 2. 1 on account of removing the Big Day Zav, 1 on account of switching to Big Day Lavan. The next time around, Big Day Zav, again 2. Next time, Big Day Lavan, again 2. The next time into Big Day Zav required again 2, which gives us 9 in total. Where do you get 10? Amalek Rabban will respond, Kiddusha Basra, you know where the last Kiddush takes place? Ki Pashat Big Day Kodesh. V'lagdish Big Day Chayil. When he removed the Big Day Kodesh and put on his own private, non-Kodesh clothing after the Avodah of Yom Kippurim, that's where he did the Kiddush. So the Gemara and the Kasha figured Kiddush Dan Raglayim is only meant to enable him to do Avodah. But once he's done the Avodah, he's already finished and completed the entire Seder Yom Kippurim, why would he do another Kiddush Dan Raglayim? The Gemara concludes, apparently, even though he's done his Avodah, but he will make another Kiddush on account of removing the Big Day Zav. Because remember, according to Rabbanan, 1 Kiddush is required always on account of removal. So even though he's done Avodah Yom Kippurim, he's about to switch into Big Day Chol, 1 Kiddush is yet to be done. That's the 10th Kiddush, on account of removing the Big Day Zav. In time for Brit Chazara, we had a discussion regarding the Tefillah, which the Rabbanan required upon entering the Azara. The question was, does Chatzitza interfere? The answer was it does. B'ya b'miktzas, a partial entry, is that considered? Yes, it is. What about if he's outside but engaged in avodah, such as doing shechita with a long knife? We left that unresolved. We learned that the Tefillah and Kippur generally took place in the Azara, as we learned from our pasuk Makam Kadosh, except for the first one, which was outside, on top of Shar HaMayim, which was 23 amas plus above the Azara level, which proved to us that this Ein Itam spring, which came from next mountain, was also sourced at a high point, 23 amas plus above the Azara level, to allow for the water to gravitate to its former level up on the mikvah, on top of the Shar HaMayim. We had a Mishnah which discussed the Seder of the Tamid. He was Toivel, he was Big Day Zav, he Kiddush Nine Raglayim, he did a Parsha Shechita, proceeded to the Kabbalah, to the Ketores, Hetev Saneres, Makar of the Eivarm, Chavitin, Yain. We discussed the fact that they would alleviate the chill from that mikvah, and we concluded that apparently our Mishnah is not in line with Rabbi Meir, because the Gemara concludes that although both Rabbi Meir and Rabbanan require 2 times Kiddush Dan Raglayim when switching into new begadim, however, according to Rabbi Meir, both Kiddush pertain to the new set of clothing. In which case, when he's switching from Chol to Kodesh, he would still have to have 2 Kiddush. Whereas our Mishnah says there's only 1 Kiddush. Apparently we found Shittas Rabbanan, who maintain that the first Kiddush was related to the Pshita, and only the second Kiddush was related to the Levisha. And therefore when he's switching from Chol to Kodesh, you only need 1 Kiddush on account of the Big Day Kodesh that he's putting on. The Gemara concluded with the Cheshbon, how we turn up with 10 times Kiddush Dan Raglayim throughout Yom Kippur, both according to our Meir and according to the Rabban. Take care and Atzlacha Rabbi to you.